Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm finally talking about the new album from Moby, Always Centered at Night. I don't really know how to talk about Moby these days. One of the most polarizing figures in electronic music and one of the unlikeliest people to become a public figure on the mainstream level that he has. Some weirdo vegan nerd with a background in hardcore punk who was there in the pioneering days of the 90s rave scene and also really helped kickstart the rise of commercial downtempo in the 2000s, managing to get an insane amount of success mostly off the back of his album Play, which primarily got on everyone's radar at the time through having been licensed out to commercials and the like. It's a little crazy in retrospect to think that there was ever a time when this guy was actually considered cool, especially nowadays, where it seems for every genuine fan of his work who found his stuff really connecting with them on an emotional level and formative to their tastes, I seem to see another person who views him to be a pretentious, self-righteous, browbeating asshole who never should have been allowed to see the level of success he did in the first place. I obviously fall within the former category, at least in all the various interviews and whatnot I've seen of the guy. He always seemed like a perfectly nice and down-to-earth dude. There may be some credence to the self-righteous bit, but I've always felt like the guy meant well. And all the crazy ups and downs his career has gone through are low-key kind of fascinating to follow. I would still be interested in doing a proper discography review for him someday, even if it's not within my current plans. Not to mention, many of the criticisms that I've seen levied at him can sometimes go too far to the point where it feels like people are trying to come up with a more moralistic excuse to disparage his having this kind of awkward vibe around him and not fitting well into the world of celebrity. I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out like he had undiagnosed autism or ADHD or something to that effect, I don't know. In any case, I do not think that he deserves nearly the level of shit he often gets. But at the same time, it's not like I don't get where his detractors come from. Even if you get past all the weird moves he's made in more recent years that saw everyone collectively giving him the side eye, like the Natalie Portman thing, or the weird CIA thing, or I just recently learned he commissioned an entire freaking documentary about his life story, which he narrates himself, and was unsurprisingly primarily met with mixed to outright negative reviews. I mean, a number of those reviews I read clearly came from the perspective of someone who always hated Moby from the outset and had, like, every resentment they had about him reconfirmed to them. But it's not like there was any possible way to make a documentary like that not look like a shameless vanity project from concept alone. I don't think I'm interested in watching it. But all of that is completely ignoring his actual music, which I've also had a weird off-and-on relationship with. Every review I've given out of his music in previous years has been positive. He has several albums I properly love and have remained a big formative part of my life, such as Everything Is Wrong, 18, Last Night, or Wait For Me. I don't think he has any albums that don't at least have something to like about them, and all of them have been kind of different in such a way where anytime he does release a new album, I'll at least be interested enough to see what he has to offer this time. But at the same time, since I started following him when I was in high school around 2012-ish, I don't think I've ever actively looked forward to or gotten excited about a new album he came out with. Wait For Me was the last album of his which I personally liked enough to want to, actively keep around and return to longer term, and that album came out in 2009. All his albums since have been likable enough in the moment, but wouldn't give me any reason to want to come back to them, and left me feeling increasingly ambivalent on them as time would go on. And aside from These Systems Are Failing in 2016 being an out-of-nowhere turn for a noisy and bricked-out electronic punk style, there hasn't been much from him that really put him out of his comfort zone or added that much of substance to the conversation. The last thing to note he did in his music was orchestral reworks of his old material, as well as of course starting up a whole record label called Always Centered at Night, which dropped loads of singles over the past 2 years, culminating in all of their inclusions on this very album. I didn't get a single request to talk about this album. I haven't even really seen anyone talking about it at all, and I wouldn't be surprised if maybe this video underperforms out of people just wanting to forget he ever existed or something. I myself had no real expectations of this album being anything special to write home about. So I think you can imagine my absolute shock when I got around to listening to this newest album and realizing I thought it was actually great. Not just good, properly great. It's easily his best album since the 2000s and might just be one of his best albums, period. I mean, when I got into making videos on new albums from the Black Dog, Music, Moby, and Ski Mask all released within the same week of each other, I never in a million years would have expected the freaking Moby album would be my easy favorite of those. It's obviously not to say I expect everyone to agree with me on this point. It's not an album that really pops out at you on the surface, especially if you haven't already been a Moby fan for a minute now. And it probably won't surprise people to hear that much of the album does still stick to a lot of the same moody and atmospheric styles you'd probably expect from him. But at the same time, they're being presented in such a way where if you didn't already know that Moby was involved in them, you wouldn't be able to easily tell. A lot of the instrumentals here, while rather stripped back, feel like they have a more contemporary polish to them to fit with the electronic scene of today. Which, to be fair, already has a lot of 90s revivalism going on, so he can make something that sounds kind of like Everything Is Wrong and get it to fit in the commercial scene of today. But even with that in mind, this isn't an album that strikes me as a throwback to his old rave days. He's not relying nearly as heavily on the instrumental tricks that got him his biggest success back in the day, like those typically recognizable Moby synth strings. And he doesn't sing at any point on the album either. In fact, the main draw of this album is that Moby pieced together a bunch of instrumentals in various different styles for other guest singers to take the focus. And all the guest singers are people of color. Not a single white singer to be found here. Also, the only guest who I'd heard of previously was Serpent with Feet showing up on the opener. Oh, and Jose James showing up on the closer. I knew him from his appearance on that one Goldie album in 2017, but that's it. This was an album that Moby designed primarily to be uplifting other voices. And that's especially refreshing coming after all these years of introspective navel-gazing and mining his own history for nostalgia. Now, that concept wouldn't necessarily mean anything if the songs weren't there to back it up, but not only does every single track have a really strong and memorable tune, the guest singers bring a sense of life and energy and passion to these tracks which Moby wouldn't be able to deliver himself. Even if a lot of these tracks' the lyrical subject matter still focuses on very downbeat themes of sadness and feeling lost in the world and that kind of thing, none of them approach their vocals in the same bleak and defeated and beaten down by life manner that Moby himself usually does. Even in this album's darkest moments, it always feels like there's at least some flickers of hope left in all the singers' voices. Take how the album starts with opener On Air. On paper, it's a pretty standard downbeat piano ballad, and Serpent with Feet is approaching the track with a particular aching falsetto looking to really tug at those heartstrings. But the hook is like, it's been a minute since I've seen you smile, but I believe in us somehow. Like it's looking for the rays of hope in a bad situation. I mean, to be honest, I don't actually have much to say or break down about the lyrics all over this album. I'm probably not going to focus on that too much in this video, but the point is, as downbeat as the themes are, there's a fair bit more optimism behind this album than you typically get out of Moby. I will say that opener didn't stick out to me that much on first listen, and it does make for a pretty low-key start to this thing, although I will say it did markedly grow on me the more times I put this thing on. I do especially like how the chord progression gets like darker and more dramatic during the chorus. It's a nice touch there. I'll say this is a solid highlight anyway. The album does, however, start to pick up more energy as we move into Dark Days with Lady Blackbird, which goes for much more of a soul and R&B direction and has a fair bit more defined pulse to the down-tempo beat behind it. Again, still a pretty downbeat idea behind this one about like flying away from the apocalypse, but Lady Blackbird's vocals convey a sense of confidence and poise that lets me still feel like everything's eventually going to be alright in the end. That's another really strong and striking highlight. But as solid as those first two tracks are, the first cut on the album that let me know I was in for something special with this album is the following track, Where Is Your Pride, featuring the late Benjamin Zephaniah, a British dub poet, writer, musician, and fellow vegan activist who passed away just this past December, so this might have been the last collaboration he worked on during his life. I mean, in one breath, I will admit that this track is probably actually not as big a favorite as the first two, as the idea behind it is, like, it's pretty repetitive. Zephaniah is, like, running through a spoken list of concepts and emotions and ideas and asks where each one of them is in your life, I guess. Where is your love? Where is your faith? Where is your passion? Where is your drive? Where is your pain? Where is your sorrow? Etc., etc. The whole track is like that. It gave me the same feeling as the end of Left Field's Leftism, ending in the 21st century poem, like, making observations on the world like, how many bridges will burn until we learn? It's not that deep. However, if this is technically not one of my favorite tracks, that should let you know how damn consistent this album is, because this track is still really damn cool. Zephaniah's deep voice is still able to sell the track in such a way to make it feel more deep and meaningful and wise, still presenting him in a way that feels like an appropriate tribute to his memory. But more importantly, the instrumental goes for a classic drum and bass approach, like the kind of thing you'd hear out of Goldie or A Guy Called Gerald in the mid-90s. I've never heard Moby make a track that sounded anything like this, off the top of my head at least. And again, this was the moment at which I really started to get excited for what I was hearing on this album. These first 3 tracks were all so completely different from each other, but still really hit in their own separate ways. In fact, Where Is Your Pride is not the only classic drum and bass style track on this project. There's another one later on called Medusa, featuring Ainsley Jones. That's the same vocalist that Moby worked on with many years ago for the track Alice on his Last Night album. That track goes even harder. It's probably the single hardest hitting track in the bunch. There's like more of an edge to this one and more of a sense of propulsion than Where Is Your Pride. There's a really solid tune behind it as well. It is this wider stylistic variety that really allowed this whole project to hit as immediately with me as it did. I mean, there's also a couple of tracks on this thing that go for some, like, spacey disco-influenced flavor, such as Wild Flame featuring Danae Wellington and Should Sleep featuring J.P. Bimini, both really bringing some energy and fire to the track listing, as their fire-themed lyrics imply. The former is a bit more energetic, the latter a bit more mid-tempo, but still delivering really bright and colorful R&B vocal hooks and stomping dance grooves. They're probably the most mood-brightening tracks on the album. But there's also some tracks that go for a more chill mix of 90s influenced dance beats as seen on tracks like Feelings Come Undone, featuring Raquel Rodriguez, and Fall Back, featuring Akemi Fox. These cuts hit a nice balance of both being very moody and atmospheric, but also clearly dance tracks at their core with a solid groove to back themselves up. And while the singers on both tracks are some of the more slightly mumbly and indistinct of the guest performances here, without having the strongest emotional performances, they are still as enjoyable in the moment as any other singer showing up here, and the hooks behind these tracks are some of the catchier in the bunch to make up for it. But of course, in between all these more dance-centric tracks are also a bunch of atmospheric trip-hop type cuts which take the tempo down a fair bit, but can often end up as some of the most effective emotional hitters in the bunch. The best one of those for me is probably We're Going Wrong featuring Brio Banyan. This is actually a cover of a track originally by the band Cream, though I personally think this interpretation is much better, more full-sounding, catchier, and more emotionally evocative than the original. To be fair, I was never the biggest Cream fan aside from White Room, but this version makes it feel like this track always belonged to Moby from the beginning. It kind of already sounds like the kind of thing he would write, and he really pulls out all the instrumental stops to make this track feel as big and epic as it can. I feel like there's even some, like, orchestral touches here, like some barely present brass sections way in the background in some parts, and yeah, that's really cool. As far as the other trip-hop-ish cuts on this album go, my second favorite is probably Transit featuring Gaida. While this track doesn't have one of the most memorable hooks on the album or a tune that's as likely to get stuck in my head, the melodic progressions the track goes through are still really damn satisfying and pretty and keep moving and shifting around in a cool way. It's the kind of tune that feels like it could have been partially improvised, but it's presented in such a way that paradoxically feels very tight and controlled at the same time. And Moby brings back some of his usual synth string pads in a way that both perfectly fits the track and makes it feel much bigger and more cinematic without making it feel overbearing. A similar highlight is Precious Mind featuring India Carney. While this track doesn't hit me on as deep an emotional level, it does have a stronger and more memorable hook. The way India Carney harmonizes with herself and the way her voice is covered with so much reverb to create a more expansive and windy ambient subspace. Also the addition of some flutes on this track and some of those nice piano riffs and bass lines going through this cut, there's just really nice touches all around as well. And that leaves the way this album ends. We got Sweet Moon featuring Chocolate. That's another kind of trip-hop-ish sort of track, but it's got a lot more of an edge to it. Darker and more foreboding tone with a lot of menacing electric guitar riffs. And the way Chocolate's smoother R&B vocals are worked against an instrumental like that makes this track feel like it could almost work as like a James Bond theme or something like that. Definitely getting some vibes off of this track that remind me of some of the edgier moments on like Massive Attack's Mezzanine, and that's pretty cool. Another track that doesn't sound like anything else on the album adds further variety. But the album finally closes in a much more traditional way, much in the same way it started, with a regular old piano ballad called Ache For, featuring Jose James. Instrumentally, it's the single most simplistic and stripped back mix on display here, with nothing but solo piano and some mildly jazzy percussion underneath. Although some of Moby's typical thicker synth string pads do subtly build up a little more in certain parts to give the track a more dramatic effect. Not the kind of track that would stand out much, if not for the fact that Jose James might very well be the single most technically impressive singer brought on for this album, full stop. This dude's voice just sounds so freaking butter smooth and perfectly composed and hitting ranges of high notes and lower notes completely effortlessly. I already thought the guy knocked it out of the park when I heard him on Goldie's The Journeyman, basically delivering the exact same kind of jazzy piano ballad track as this, and he knocks it out of the park here as well. Even if the track's not one of the most musically interesting here, it still hits on the merit of that guy's vocals alone. And yeah, that's everything on Always Centered at Night. There's seriously not a single weak track in the bunch here. It might very well be the first Moby album I've ever heard to be all killer and no filler. I'm actually kind of stunned by how damn strong and consistent this entire album is. Now again, I would still get it if somebody decided to pick this thing up and ended up thinking it was just as underwhelming as anything else Moby's done in the past several years. Like, the sound of this album is, at the end of the day, still all very safe and accessible and inoffensive enough where I could even easily see this thing getting nominated for a Grammy. Guy is not exactly about to change the game with this thing. And while this is somehow probably my favorite album of the year so far, which is absolutely crazy to say, it is worth qualifying that statement by pointing out there hasn't exactly been a lot of strong competition this year. So far, 2024 has been a pretty dry year for electronic music with very few properly great albums, not unlike 2019 was. I'm expecting, or at least really hoping, the second half of the year is able to deliver more proper quality. But, I mean, I have to give credit where credit is due. When the songs themselves are all this good and well composed, when the instrumentals are this nicely polished and well varied and all feature all these really talented singers who sell these tracks way better than Moby himself ever could, I can't complain about any of it too much. And for him to put an album this damn good this late into his career and after so many years of mostly unremarkable projects, a project like this that I've actually wanted to come back and keep replaying, I think that's something special. If Moby of all people, one of the music world's most infamous Debbie Downers, is able to provide some light in the darkness of the times we live in like he managed to here, I think there's some real power to that. So definitely make sure to at least give it a shot if you missed it. I'm overall feeling a strong 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.